I think what's new in contemporary conservatism is that it really, the version we have now, which is a pretty hard, often radical form of conservatism, successfully pushed aside other forms of conservatism.
If you're addicted to television political talk shows, as I am, then you're familiar with E.J. Dionne. And if you are a discerning viewer, you know that Dionne is more than a talking head. He's a quadruple threat: a columnist for the Washington Post, a professor of public policy at Georgetown, a fellow at the Brookings Institute, and the author of 7 books. If there's a common denominator to his long-term work, it's that from various angles, Dionne has surveyed the forces that have disrupted the post-World War II political consensus. Today's dysfunction afflicts not only the Democrats and the Republicans, but also the nation. We're here today to talk about Dionne's most recent book, Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. It's great to meet you.
It's really good to be here.
Listen, right off the bat, you and Hillary Clinton share something in common. As teenagers, you were both enamored of, focused on Barry Goldwater's redefining candidacy in 1964. How did you get from there to here? And I suppose implicit in that is, what are your politics today?
Well, you know, I talk about that at the beginning of the book, and I think I developed a lifelong love for political dissidents of all kinds, because my parents were conservative Republicans in a New Deal town, my hometown of Fall River. I talk about at the beginning of this book, which is very critical of conservatism, to say, you know, I don't view conservatives as some sort of alien group that you study like an anthropologist does. I have known and loved conservatives, and I get where they're coming from. I also talk in the book when I was 12 years old watching Ronald Reagan's speech for Barry Goldwater, A Time for Choosing, right before the '64 election. And I say that my dad and I, like millions of conservatives, saw that speech and said, this is the guy who's going to lead conservatives out of the wilderness. But a funny thing happened to me on the way to his leading us out of the wilderness, starting really when I was about 13 years old. About a year later, I started developing a lot of doubts about conservatism. And my dad, I will always love him for this. I love him for a lot of things. He really liked the idea of kids arguing with their parents about politics. He thought it was a good thing for us to exchange you know, views and really to disagree with us. So it was one of our favorite activities. I used to joke maybe this was a brilliant way on his part to civilize adolescent rebellion, because it was just part of our life we like to argue. You
make it sound almost religious, developing doubts.
Right. Well, in fact, religion is not unrelated to this. There are I've thought back on this, and particularly since I've written this book, and there were 2 or 3 things that were important. One is when Lyndon Johnson started putting forward the Great Society, I actually, as this kid who was interested in politics, got very excited about what he was doing. And I asked the question, why aren't we Republicans or conservatives trying to solve some of these problems? So that was a piece of it. And so for a while, I gravitated to liberal republicanism, the old Ripon society that people only of a certain age will remember, where they were trying to come up with real alternatives to what LBJ was doing. And I also write about that in the book. And over time, I realized liberal republicanism did not have much of a future, which turned out to be correct. Secondly,
except here in Massachusetts,
yes, here in where I grew up, and Frank Sargent and Ed Brooke. I mean, this was the homeland of
Charlie Baker to a degree.
To a degree. And then when I was in 2 other kind of important experiences, when I was in my Benedictine high school, we had to write a report on some religious book, and we could pick the book. And I ended up picking Martin Luther King's Strength to Love, which is a collection of his sermons. It's a little book, and it was really powerful. And for me, as a Catholic and a Christian, it made me start thinking, wait a minute, what are our obligations to racial and social justice? So that was actually, you know, something I very much remember at the time. And then lastly, the other book that my history teachers in high school, I had 2 really great high school history teachers, They said, you might enjoy this. And they gave me a book by a great historian called William Leuchtenberg called Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. And it's probably still one of the best short one-volume books on the New Deal. And I found myself getting excited about the New Deal project. And, open-minded conservative that my dad was, he told me that, if I hadn't been as well off in the 30s, he was a dentist, so everybody got hit by that, but he could make a living. But he said, if I were in the position of a lot of the people I was, helping as a dentist, I probably would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. And I read that book, and I understand why he said that. So by the time I was 17 or 18, I had gone over to the other side. But it really started when I was 13 years old.
You've written a sizable book with, I think, a pretty simple thesis that in some ways there's really nothing new about today's conservatism, that that the Tea Party is sort of a 21st century version of Goldwaterism. Am I oversimplifying? Am I off base here?
No, I don't think you're off base. I mean, there are a bunch of arguments in the book, and obviously, as you know, the history takes many different different courses. But to your point, I have a chapter in the book called "The New Old Right," and I think one of the striking things about the Tea Party, it not only went back to Goldwaterism, it often went back to the ideas of the John Birch Society. And indeed, Glenn Beck, who was briefly very popular on Fox News, had a reading list. And part of that reading list were some old John Birch Society books. I still remember, I think it was Kate Zernike of the New York Times talked to a member of the Tea Party who said, well, they say we're extreme, but they said that about the John Birch Society, too. I mean, in other words, that there is a common thread that really you could trace even farther back to opposition to the New Deal on the right. A lot of these ideas have kept sort of appearing again and again. I think what's new in contemporary conservatism is that it really, the version we have now, which is a pretty hard, often radical form of conservatism, successfully pushed aside other forms of conservatism. And when I talk about Goldwater defeating the alternative forces in the Republican Party, he just didn't defeat liberal Republicans. One of the key targets of Goldwater and the right, the Bill Buckley right too, was Eisenhower Republicanism, which I argue is really the alternative form of conservatism in our recent history. I could probably have a good argument with a conservative about whether Ike was a conservative or not. But at the time, I think most people thought he was. He was certainly fiscally cautious. He had very close to or balanced budgets. He was pro-business. He was sympathetic to religion. He obviously was in favor of American strength in the world. But he was also a conservative of the kind of Edmund Burke sort, who accepted that over time, a way of life can be worth preserving, but it sometimes has to alter itself in order to survive. And so he accepted many of the New Deal reforms as having become part of the American way of life. Again, he was very prudent about government's role, but he also saw that it had things to do, so that two of the most important programs in our history, the interstate highway system and the federal student loan program that helped millions of people, including me, go to college, were part of Ike's legacy. I discovered that one conservative who actually agrees with me on Ike is Joe Scarborough, who in a book he wrote on the Republican Party said that conservatives have to stop thinking of Ike as a liberal in golf cleats. Yeah. I think that's, and so what I'm suggesting is that if it's going to have a future, American conservatism needs to rediscover the kind of moderation and balance that was inherent in what I see as Eisenhower's form of conservatism.
Well, that brings us to Donald Trump, who is the soul of moderation and balance. I mean, to talk about the Tea Party seems, in a way, so yesterday. I mean, Trump is so today. He's inescapable. What is the Trump effect having on the Republican Party, or what will it have?
Well, I think Trump is confounding in part because he brings together sort of sets of ideas that don't usually go together in American politics. The way in which I think he does fit very much in with the Tea Party is the anger at traditional Republicans, this sense that they kept talking about immigration, but what have they done about it? If immigration is as bad as they sometimes say, why don't they go as far as I'm willing to go, Trump? Let's deport the 11 million and so on. And so on a certain set of issues, crime, support for police, comments on race that I think cross the line of racism, his whole approach to immigration, that sort of is in keeping with the Tea Party view. Not all Tea Party supporters are racist. I'm not saying that, but there is racial reaction on that side. On the other side, he is a kind of economic populist. He rips apart trade treaties and says these have been terrible for American workers. He is against cuts in Social Security and Medicare. Recently, from when we're speaking now, he said that he wants the federal government to negotiate drug prices under the Medicare program, which is a democratic idea. That is, in one sense, is a new kind of mixture, and a lot of traditional conservatives say Trump isn't a real conservative. But if I could say one other thing, I think he does represent continuity with the story I'm telling, because one of the arguments in my book is that the Republican Party has relied on the votes of white working class voters for a long time, and has really done very little for them. And this isn't just me, a liberal, speaking. This is people like Ross Douthat, the columnist for the New York Times, Rehan Salam, conservative intellectual. I mean, they wrote a whole book saying, the party of Sam's Club, as Governor Tim Pawlenty called them. These rank-and-file working-class Republicans, they look around and ask, what has the party done for me? And so in Trump, you have this odd situation of a billionaire leading a class war inside the Republican Party.
Your very first book, and I may have the title wrong, Why Americans Hate Politics. Trump seems to be the answer to that question. Not why they hate it, but the manifestation of this deep disillusionment with politics. Do you buy that?
I think the paradox is that you have this movement to the right in the Republican Party, which is making it very difficult for us to govern ourselves. And I argue that the polarization of the two parties is asymmetric. I think the data show the Republicans have moved farther to the right than Democrats have moved to the left. But one way or another, this period of obstruction, I think, creates in the public a sense that government can't work. We got a lot of problems. Why can't government do something about living standards that have decayed for a lot of people? And Trump is a rebel is a reflection of the rebellion against that. And I think for a lot of people, look, I'll just sit down and make deals and make everything work part of him. At times it carries an authoritarian kind of scary side where it sounds like he won't really negotiate, he'll just do whatever he wants. But at other times it sounds like, we got to bargain and get there, and that's much more like our tradition. One of my favorite lines on politics is from Arthur Schlesinger, the great liberal historian who worked for President Kennedy, who said basically democratic politics should be about remedy. It's about the search for remedy. And I think people look at politics right now and they don't see people searching for remedy, for problem solving. And in that sense, there are arguments I make in the new book that are very much in line with arguments I made 25 years ago. The difference between those two books, which I talk about, is at the time, way back then, I thought the Republican Party might pursue a somewhat more moderate path, moderately conservative path after Reagan, but instead they went the other way.
How did the Republican Party go from the very pragmatic Richard Nixon to the more visionary Ronald Reagan, who tactically was pragmatic?
Nixon, first of all, is one of the most fascinating figures ever in American politics, and I talk a lot about Nixon in the book as really reflecting this sort of split personality of the Republican Party right on his own staff. one of the people, I interviewed a lot of conservatives for this book who knew I was coming from the other side, but knew I was trying to understand what was going on. And Pat Buchanan, both in our interview and in his great book, actually, on Nixon's comeback, talks about how Nixon's staff was kind of split in half. And half of them were conservatives, and Nixon, shrewd that he was, knew the nominating wing of the Republican Party had moved to the right, and that he couldn't get the nomination again without the conservatives. On the other hand, there was a lot of Nixon that was still an Eisenhower Republican, and the other half of his staff, didn't like the hard statements on crime, indirectly on race, that came out of this side of the campaign. They wanted a much more moderate figure. And in governing, Nixon was also split because he did use the Southern strategy. He was willing to run on the social issues. He sort of started creating Nixon Democrats before there were Reagan Democrats in the white working class. On the other hand, this is a guy who signed the law creating the Environmental Protection Agency, the Environmental Safety and Health Administration, the opening to China. China was his idea, which the right wing really didn't like. But I think it was, the paradox is Richard Nixon's fall pushed the country, and particularly the Republican Party, to the right. First of all, because Watergate was part of a whole series of events that helped discredit government. Watergate plus Vietnam and the unease about that, plus the fact that the economy started going off the rails in the 70s. Government was something Americans really admired from Roosevelt through Ike to the Kennedy-Johnson years. And so in that sense, it moved things to the right. And it also got rid of the major force in the Republican Party who could stop a complete victory for the right, who was Richard Nixon, because he embodied, these various strands. So the way was open for Ronald Reagan. And George H.W. Bush and John Anderson in 1980, if you remember that primary campaign, took a stand for a kind of moderate conservatism and real moderation, or even a liberal republicanism, and they got beaten by Ronald Reagan. So you could see the shift in the balance of power in the party toward Reagan. The irony is that Reagan governed in a far more pragmatic way than he spoke. The first chapter of my book is called The Ambiguous Hero. And I have a quote from Charles Krauthammer, who said, "You can choose your Reagan," the conservative commentator. And, Reagan, the movement builder, the guy who spoke for Barry Goldwater, the guy my dad and I heard that night when I was 12 years old, was a real ideologue. But when he governed, he often had to govern with Democrats, both in California and with Tip O'Neill, when the Democrats controlled the House. And he was willing to make adjustments. He was willing to, after cutting taxes steeply, he was willing to raise them several times when the budget was getting completely out of balance. And so there was Reagan the ideologue, Reagan the pragmatist, and depending on what kind of Republican you are, he can be your hero, but you just pick one or the other of the two Reagans.
Seems like a good place to end. Great to meet you finally.
Really great to see you.
Take care,
Thank
EJ.
you.